Great. Hi, everyone, and thank you for viewing the MACRA Wave 4 Cost Measure Development presentation. The purpose of this presentation is to provide information about the current MACRA Wave 4 Cost Measure Development call for public comment. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Ronique Evans from CMS to start the presentation.
Thank you. Again, my name is Ronique Evans. I am the Cost Measures Lead from the Division of Quality Measurement at CMS. And I will go through the next few slides for our introduction before I'm handing it over to our measure development contractor. Next slide, please. This CMS disclaimer outlines that this presentation is a general summary intended as a reference document for stakeholders. Next slide, please. Today, I will provide an introduction overview on how episode-based cost measures are part of the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, or MIPS, within the Quality Payment Program. Then we'll provide an overview of Wave 4 development and provide some information on our approach for prioritizing clinical areas and episode groups. We will then discuss the request for public comment on candidate episode groups. And finally, we will conclude with some frequently asked questions, next steps, and relevant resources. Next slide, please. Here are a few acronyms we use throughout the presentation. It may be helpful for you guys to reference throughout the discussion. Next slide, please. To begin, I will go over the background for MIPS and the QPP program. Next slide. The Quality Payment Program has two tracks to choose from for clinicians. First, you have the Advanced Alternative Payment Models, and then the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, which we refer to as MIPS. Clinicians who participate in MIPS have their performance assessed across 4 categories: quality, cost, interoperability, and improvement activities. A clinician's performance score for each category is rolled up to a MIPS final score, which then determines a payment adjustment. CMS is developing a new participation framework called MIPS Value Pathways, or MVPs, as a way to connect the quality, cost, and improvement activities categories. The goal of the MPVs is to simplify participation in MIPS and to provide clinicians with a set of aligned measures across performance categories that are meaningful to their care practice. Today's presentation will focus on the cost performance category of MIPS. Next slide. The MIPS cost performance category started with 2 global or population-based cost measures and has now expanded to also include 18 episode-based cost measures that cover a wide range of conditions and procedures. All of these cost measures are calculated using administrative claims data, so there is no additional reporting required for clinicians. For the 2021 performance period, the cost performance category makes up 20% of the MIPS final score. This slide lists the MIPS cost measures, which cover a broad range of procedures and conditions. Next slide, please. An episode-based cost measure represents the Medicare payment for the medical care provided to a patient related to a specific episode of care. These measures only include the cost of relevant services in the episode, such as preoperative testing, direct cost of treatment, or services resulting from the treatment. The measures are intended to inform clinicians on their costs for patients so they can identify opportunities for improvement and are based on 3 types of episode groups. Acute inpatient medical condition episode groups focus on the treatment for an exacerbation of a condition requiring hospitalization, such as hospitalizations for stroke or pneumonia. Procedural episode groups focus on a procedure of a defined purpose or type, such as spine fusion surgery or screen colonoscopy. Chronic condition episode groups focus on treatment for an ongoing clinical condition at the time of a medical visit. Next slide, please. Since 2017, episode-based cost measures have been developed in waves or cycles, where a number of measures follow the same development cycle and timeline. So far, we have completed 3 waves of development, where we have developed 8 measures in Wave 1, 11 measures in Wave 2, and 5 measures in Wave 3. We recently completed Wave 3 of development, which began in 2019, involving the input and expertise from over 160 members. Wave 3 was the first wave in which we developed chronic condition episode-based cost measures for diabetes and asthma COPD. We're now seeking input via the current public comment period to start Wave 4 of cost measure development. I will now turn the presentation over to Joyce Lamb from Acumen, the measure development contractor.
Thanks, Renique. My name is Joyce Lamb, and I'm the project manager from Acumen for the cost measure development project. So I'll start by providing a brief overview of Wave 4 of cost measure development. Next slide, please. Our process for measure development involves collecting a wide range of stakeholder feedback so that we can incorporate it into each stage of the process, from prioritizing which measures to develop to the detailed specifications. This feedback helps ensure that measures meet CMS's Meaningful Measures goals. The Meaningful Measures framework is an initiative which identifies the highest priorities for measurement and improvement so that we only assess the core issues that are the most critical to providing high-quality care and improving patient outcomes. In addition, feedback from stakeholders allows for an iterative development and testing process so that we can combine stakeholder expertise and experience and environmental scans with empirical data. In waves 1, 2, and 3, we obtained stakeholder input by convening experts in clinical subcommittees structured around a clinical area like cardiovascular disease management or a measure framework like the chronic condition framework. The clinical subcommittees met for a one-day in-person meeting to review data, discuss different options, and vote on preferred episode groups. We considered this input and worked with CMS, who would then confirm which measures to develop in that particular wave. In Wave 4, we are changing this process to provide more flexibility in how stakeholders can share their input on measure prioritization, given the competing demands on clinician time over these winter months. As such, we are holding a public comment period instead of convening clinical subcommittees so that clinicians, specialty societies, and patients, families, and caregivers can participate around their schedule. The public comment period will also be open for about 2 months. We do expect to revisit this public comment approach for future development. Next slide, please. This slide provides a bit more detail about the development process and the role that stakeholders play at each stage. We have a standing technical expert panel, or TEP, which provides high-level guidance for topics across the project. This has included discussing questions about a new measure framework and which clinical areas should be priorities to develop, which has helped shape the focus areas for Wave 4. Within each wave, we typically convene clinical subcommittees to provide input on candidate episode groups using the prioritization criteria that the TEP helped to develop. In Wave 4, we'll gather this input through the public comment period instead. Finally, we have the clinician expert work groups that are composed of 15 to 20 members with expertise in the care on which the measures focus, including clinicians across the patient care continuum. Clinician expert work group members provide detailed input on every aspect of the specifications. Next slide, please. Here we provide an overview of the development timeline that we followed for the Wave 3 measures. The clinical subcommittee and expert work groups met several times at in-person and virtual meetings since mid-2019 and discussed all components of the measures and their specifications. As you can see here, the clinical subcommittees convened in spring 2019. After CMS approved the measures for development, we convened the clinician expert work groups for in-person meetings in August 2019. Along with the service assignment and refinement webinars in early 2020, clinician expert work group members had 2 meetings in which they provided detailed input used to develop the measure specifications. Then in August and September of 2020, we conducted a national field test of the measures with their draft specifications. During this period, we sent out around 214,000 reports to clinicians and clinician groups via the QPP portal so that they could review how they would have performed on the measure and share any feedback with us. Afterwards, the expert work group members convened once more for the post-field test refinement webinars to discuss field testing feedback and any refinements to the measures to finalize the specifications. Next slide, please. Here, we have a preliminary timeline for Wave 4 cost measure development, which will last around 18 months through to May 2022. The clinician and expert work group meetings and field testing processes are similar to the Wave 3 timeline in the previous slide. The main difference shown here for Wave 4 is for the use of the public comment period instead of the clinical subcommittees. Next slide, please. So in this section, I'll walk through how we prioritize clinical areas and episode groups for development in preparing for Wave 4. Next slide, please. Our approach is something that we have developed and refined over the years. This includes incorporating feedback from the TEP, the patient perspective, clinical subcommittees, and expert work groups about what are the most important factors to consider when deciding which measures to develop. As mentioned earlier, this prioritization process helps ensure that the cost measures are aligning with CMS's Meaningful Measures initiative. To provide some background, we first posted a draft list of episode groups and trigger codes several years ago, which we often call the December 2016 posting for short. This was a list of 117 episode groups that clinician stakeholders had identified as contenders for development and which we sought public comment on. Since then, we've used this December 2016 posting as a starting point for waves 1, 2, and 3. We've also received feedback about expanding that list. At the time of creating that list, there weren't measure frameworks to cover all types of care, such as post-acute care. So this is something that we've discussed with the TEP. In February 2020, we met with our TEP to talk about different ways of approaching measure prioritization. For example, we could focus on developing measures in clinical areas that don't currently have cost measures. Another way of thinking about prioritization could be to build more cost measures for areas where there may already be measures, but which are high cost and have strong opportunities for improvement. Another consideration that the TEP highlighted was identifying the specialties that don't currently have any cost measures in MIPS. The TEP expressed support for developing measures for specialties not covered by the current measure set or frameworks, like psychiatrists or physical therapists. Next slide, please. In addition to looking at clinical areas which could be measurement gaps, we have also a set of criteria to help determine which of these areas to prioritize. This builds on input we've received from our TEP and patient and family perspective over the years. The first criterion is clinical coherence. In other words, is this an aspect of care where we can compare clinician decisions for similar patients? This could include considerations of staging, severity, and what we can distinguish from data. It's important to remember that the measure framework offers multiple techniques to ensure the clinical comparability of patients. These include stratifying the measure into more similar cohorts and using risk adjustment to account for patient and other factors present at the start of care. There's an appendix to this slide deck that walks through each of the steps in measure construction in case you want more information about these frameworks. The second criterion is the impact of the measure and its potential importance to MIPS. This includes looking at the potential for covering a large number of clinicians, patients, and cost. The third criterion is the opportunity for cost performance improvement. Importantly, a measurement gap is not the same as a performance gap necessarily. So this criterion ensures that we are considering the ways in which a cost measure can help clinicians to make decisions for cost-effective and high-quality care, such as by improving care coordination. The fourth and final criterion is alignment with quality. These cost measures are intended for use in MIPS alongside quality measures, so we need to consider how the measures could work holistically to assess value. Next slide, please. Once we have prioritized measures for development, measures must also have certain essential features to ensure that they can effectively assess clinician cost performance. Acumen has worked with stakeholders, including the TEP, to define and vet these standards. The measures must consider the clinician role in care, which can include factors like practice standards, what services are clinically related to the condition or procedure being assessed, and whether there is sufficient variation in performance to be able to distinguish between individual providers. Further, it's important that measure construction is both readily understandable and able to convey information to providers about ways to improve. Finally, the measure should be specified in a way that allows the measure to be consistently calculated and reproduced using Medicare administrative claims data. Next slide, please. And now that we've covered the measure development process and the criteria that are essential for measures to be effective, this section will walk through the request for public comment on candidate episode groups for Wave 4. Next slide, please. Using the factors that we've discussed, we have identified 7 priority episode groups across 4 clinical areas. We also looked at a range of feedback from stakeholders, including from the clinical subcommittees and clinician expert work groups during Waves 1 through 3 and TEP input. We ran empirical analyses to estimate the potential impact, considered the potential for MIPS value pathways, or MVPs, and areas that CMS has identified as priorities. The 4 clinical areas include heart failure, mental and behavioral health, therapy and rehabilitation, and rheumatology arthritis. The therapy framework is a new measure framework that we plan to develop in Wave 4 and may build on the chronic condition framework that we have developed through Wave 3. In the next few slides, we'll walk through each of these 4 clinical areas and highlight the areas that we're particularly interested in hearing from you on. Next slide, please. The first clinical area is heart failure. This is an episode group that we have been discussing with stakeholders over the past few years as a common and costly condition. Heart disease has been the leading cause of death for Americans 65 and over for the past several decades, and as of 2017, CMS found that 42% of Medicare beneficiaries aged 65 and over had at least one heart condition. In our previous development activities, stakeholders have expressed interest in heart failure. First, the Cardiovascular Disease Management Clinical Subcommittee in Waves 1 and 2 voted in favor of heart failure as an acute inpatient medical condition as one of their preferred measures due to its high prevalence and cost. Also, the TEP suggested heart failure as a strong candidate, again because of the cost and clinician coverage. Now that we have developed a framework to assess chronic conditions, we believe that a chronic condition heart failure measure has even greater potential to be impactful than one that focuses on inpatient care only. During the public comment period, we're seeking input on the cost measure concept and a couple of questions. In particular, how to capture different subtypes and severity levels of heart failure using administrative claims data, and what considerations are there regarding the distinct role of clinicians in providing care. For instance, the distinct roles of internal medicine versus cardiology specialists. Next slide, please. The next clinical area is mental and behavioral health. Our team identified major depressive disorder, schizoaffective disorder, and bipolar disorder as potential episode groups within this broad area. Each of these has the potential to be impactful with high beneficiary, clinician, and cost coverage, although major depressive disorder is the most prevalent by far. In our preliminary analyses, we estimate up to around 1.5 million beneficiaries that could be covered by such a measure. Of course, these are very rough preliminary numbers that are included in our posting document using an initial set of specifications that we would work with clinician expert work group members to refine. Another factor we considered was that psychiatrists participating in MIPS currently do not have an episode-based cost measure. In addition to this specialty gap in coverage, there is also a strong opportunity for improvement. A measure on one of these episode groups would capture variation in treatment, frequency, and intensity of complications and encourage coordination among care teams. During the public comment period, we are seeking your input on determining which of these potential episode groups to develop in Wave 4, capturing opportunities for care improvement, such as outpatient treatment or mitigating complications, and accounting for different severity levels. Next slide, please. The third clinical area is therapy and rehabilitation. Candidate episode groups for this clinical area include low back pain and low back and neck pain. Both of these are very common conditions with a wide range of treatment options and patient outcomes. Like mental and behavioral health, this is an area where there is a measurement gap, as physical therapists and related specialties currently do not have episode-based cost measures in MIPS. The TEP also highlighted therapy as an area that they believe should be prioritized. This would be a new framework that we tackle in Wave 4 and which can build on the chronic condition framework. We are seeking your input on whether to develop low back pain by itself or low back and neck pain, identifying services for ongoing therapy, management, and care, and addressing heterogeneity in the patient cohort, such as the distinction between patients with chronic pain versus patients with a recent spinal surgery. Next slide, please. The fourth and final clinical area is rheumatology arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is the most common type of inflammatory arthritis and is a common autoimmune disease. As with the other areas, there is both a coverage gap, as rheumatologists and MIPS currently don't have an episode-based cost measure, and there is variation in treatment, such as drug options and therapy aimed at reducing symptoms, preventing joint damage, and decreasing complications and severity of comorbidities. During the public comment period, we're seeking your input on accounting for different levels of severity, reflecting the role of different types of clinicians in managing the condition, such as internal medicine and rheumatology clinicians, and capturing opportunities for care improvement and potential mitigation of complications. Next slide, please. The public comment posting materials are currently available on the CMS Measures Management System, or MMS, webpage. The specific page is called CMS Currently Accepting Comments. The first document that you can download is the call for public comment. This provides more detail for what we've talked about today, including the background of cost measure development, an overview of cost measure frameworks and essential features of cost measures, results of preliminary empirical analyses to estimate the potential impact on beneficiary, clinician, and cost coverage, and the list of questions for clinical areas, candidate episode groups, and topics for future development. The other document available for download is a workbook containing the preliminary specifications for the Wave 4 candidate episode groups. This workbook lists the draft preliminary trigger codes that we use to define patient cohorts, which we're seeking input on. Next slide, please. The public comment period for Wave 4 development opened in mid-December and is open until February 5, 2021. To provide feedback, stakeholders may submit a response or upload a comment letter as a PDF or Word document in the Wave 4 Measure Development Survey from December 16 through to February 5 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Stakeholders may also email their input to this email address, MACRA episode-based cost measures info@acumenllc.com, and express interest in participating in Wave 4 development through our mailing list. The URL for that mailing list is provided here. After the end of the public comment period, we'll review all your input and work with CMS to confirm which measures that we'll be developing in Wave 4. Then we'll get started with convening work groups to build out the specifications for each of the measures. Next slide, please. One of the other things that we're doing during this public comment period is thinking about future development. We've heard interest from stakeholders about a range of other measures, so we've included questions that would help us plan for future waves. For example, we have heard interest in measures for clinicians who often have less of a patient-facing role, such as anesthesiology, radiology, and pathology. One challenge is what framework would be appropriate to capture their role, and what types of costs are clinically related to their care that should be included in a measure. We have also had interest in measures for clinical areas like otolaryngology, emergency medicine, and oncology. These would need to include considerations such as how to account for staging. We encourage stakeholders to share their thoughts about these clinical areas and ways to address any challenges that they see with developing measures. This will be very helpful for us in planning ahead for future measures development activities. Next slide, please. Finally, I'll wrap up this webinar by going over some resources and next steps. Next slide, please. First, here are some common questions and answers that we have come across. Why use a public comment approach instead of clinical subcommittees? We wanted to provide more flexibility in engaging with measure prioritization than convening panels of clinicians as we've done in the past. In fact, one of the things that we heard during Wave 3 field testing last year was that clinicians and specialty societies have had limited bandwidth given the challenges in 2020, which are stretching into this year. Does the public comment approach replace the traditional clinical subcommittee? For Wave 4, yes. We'll revisit this for Wave 5. Why is there only one new framework for therapy being developed? We weighed different considerations, including the need for more chronic condition measures in high-impact areas like mental and behavioral health, and to meet other areas with measurement and performance gaps. We also believe that therapy is a strong starting point to build on the chronic condition framework. How can person and family stakeholders engage during Wave 4? We encourage people with lived experiences with the conditions to provide input during the public comment period. The posted document includes topics that we are particularly interested in your input on, such as identifying what indicators of quality and cost measures should align with, and what opportunities for improvement you note from your experience. Next slide, please. In terms of next steps, our team will review and compile the stakeholder feedback to make recommendations to CMS about which episode groups to develop in Wave 4. Then CMS will make the final decision on which episodes to develop. We'll then move to identifying clinician expert work groups and person and family partners by reviewing comments, expressing interest in participating, and posting a call for nominations later this year. As mentioned, stakeholders may indicate their interest in Wave 4 participation by signing up for the mailing list using the link on the screen. Next slide, please. Here we have a list of cost measure resources along with the URL. This includes the CMS currently accepting comments page, which is where you can download the public comment posting materials. Next, we have the MACRA feedback page, which contains many useful resources about the episode-based cost measure development process, specifications for previously developed cost measures, and more. Within the MACRA feedback page, you may also access the draft list of MACRA episode groups and trigger codes, or the December 2016 posting. We've also included the slides for the mailing list and the ways forward measure development survey where you can submit your comments. This slide deck also contains 2 appendices that provide an overview of the existing episode-based cost measure frameworks. Appendix A is on chronic condition measure construction, and Appendix B covers measure construction for acute inpatient medical condition and procedural measures. This slide deck is available on the Quality Payment Program webinar library. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact the Acumen MACRA Cost Measures support team at MACRA episode-based cost measures info@acumenllc.com. Thank you for joining today, and we look forward to hearing your feedback during this public comment period. This concludes the presentation.